So, with talking about women in ministry, it's going to inevitably make us talk about women in leadership as well. And they're kind of back and forth, so I'll more or less use those things synonymously. Let's start with more of a discussion question. Before we get to that one, though, have any of you ever personally known a female pastor? Known them? You have? Was it someone local here in New Mexico, somewhere else, Texas? Where was it? Okay. Sure. You don't remember who? But somewhere here in New Mexico. Okay. Is that your only... Okay. Okay. And was there any, from any of the people that you knew, was there any apparent conflicts with them being a woman in leadership or in ministry, with either the kids, youth, or senior pastor? Okay. Sure. Sure. But I guess there's always people around. Anyways, they'll tell you shouldn't be the pastor, you know? These things happen. But, okay, anybody else known somebody personally who was a female pastor? Terry? Sure. Now, did she ever mention having any difficulties as far as people just kind of thinking she didn't belong there or looking down on her or anything like that? Not really? Was that here? Was that out in Texas? Where was it? Okay. And how long did she do that for? Okay. And that was her, just that one time was the only, okay. Did, that's good. So, we all have moms, don't we? I was going to ask you something about that. So did she carry papers with anybody? Like ministry papers, license? Oh, okay. And did something happen to stop her? Was there opposition? If it's not too personal, I mean, obviously. Oh, okay. Okay. Like a church split, or they just decided to disband? Oh, I gotcha. Yeah. Okay. Well, so it really didn't have time to be a problem, huh? Great, go ahead. Uh-huh. Sure. Okay. Did she seem to have any opposition from being in that leadership position, or no? Okay. Hmm. Okay. All right. It seems like I've seen a lot more people have a problem with women being a senior position pastor over a children's or youth. I've noticed that. I don't know, like what the biblical basis would be for that, because in the Bible, you're either a pastor or not a pastor. Yeah, I don't know, maybe. Anyways, did you have any personal experience? No? Okay, so nobody else has anything? Well, you got a long time to go. No, run away. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Okay, don't do it. Run away. Okay, so let's say to the discussion question then. What weaknesses may there be specific to women in leadership that you don't think would be a weakness for a man in leadership? It's your own thoughts here. There's no right or wrong answer. Terry, go ahead. More emotional? Okay. do I know her?
She's on social media. And
Oh, okay.
Big people. Anyway.
They're big people? You walked right through that one, didn't you? Go ahead.
They get more emotional.
Mm-hmm.
She's real emotional when she's up there.
Oh, is this like a television pastor? Is that who this person is?
What?
This person's like one of those television pastors? Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah, and it's just they're more emotional whenever they're up there preaching. But then you have this other one that is like a teacher part, but she don't get emotional with it,
Mm-hmm.
but she brings it out. And I don't know, I'm not putting the man down, okay?
Sure.
I'm just saying that you can tell the difference.
Mm-hmm.
The women are more emotional with stuff. Men are too sometimes. Get out there and cry. Not very often. But there's just a difference.
Mm-hmm. So are you saying that's a weakness or just a difference?
I think it could be a weakness.
Okay. Tell me more about that. Why do you think it could be a weakness?
If you get too weak up there while you're trying to put the point across,
Mm-hmm.
or if you're up there praying for somebody, it could go on and on.
Sure.
Where if you just speak it,
Just drop it. I gotcha. Okay, so maybe by means of like belaboring the point. Is that what you're saying? Like just kind of dragging things out a little bit too much? Okay, all right. Anybody else? Can you? Okay. Now, are you? If you feel comfortable sharing this, I'm not going to ask this from everybody because I don't want to cause division or anything. But if you're comfortable sharing, do you have a problem with women in any position? No. Okay, so from top to bottom, you don't care.
they just don't really get the president. That's only one. But being in the ministry part,
Let me turn up. Okay, all right. So, what weaknesses can you potentially see that would be specific to women that you don't think men would have that same weakness? Teresa, you got something? Being in front of everybody? You don't think that women can be in front of everybody as well as men can? Okay. Never mind, I'll keep that. Anybody else? No? Okay. Well, we'll go ahead and plow on through here. And if you guys think of something, wave me down. Also, don't forget that you can always say something later by means of the question box. Okay. Let's see. So coming up, we're going to be looking at specific passages, book by book, throughout the Bible that talk about women in leadership and in ministry. So, like for instance, that passage from 1 Timothy that I mentioned last Sunday, that passage in 1 Corinthians that says that women have to be quiet in the church, or the passage in 1 Peter that talks about a woman being weaker. What does that mean? What does Peter mean by it? I should say, and then some other ones like that. Miriam. Mm-hmm. Well, that's what we're going to look at tonight. But I would more giving an overview of what we're going to be talking about in the future. We're going to look at specific verses. But tonight, we're not really going to look at specific verses. Tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to go through and just kind of highlight women in ministry and leadership by way of examples and see what that has to say for us today. Before we get going too far, I had to just start the study off by saying the Assemblies of God, which is the denomination that we are a part of, has an official position on this already. I obviously can have my own views, but as far as the district, and the general council is concerned, they not only allow for but encourage women in ministry positions, such as leadership and whatnot. So you'll see in the Assemblies of God there are women pastors. They're not overly common still, but they are there. There are some denominations that do not allow for women ministers. And so it really just depends what denomination you're a part of. Then there's obviously the non-denominational, which gets a little bit tricky because sometimes what that means is we don't want to be under anyone's authority, and that's just kind of a problem sometimes, when you kind of go that non-denominational. There's actually a female pastor I just found out. This was probably 2019. She was a teacher in a church for about 2 years, and then she quit, decided she was gay, and started doing an OnlyFans, and awkward. Hey, that's the girl that told me about Jesus. Oh, there's some nude pictures of her. Fantastic. It's just a little awkward. I don't know exactly what you do with that, but seems like really crossing a line on that one. Not that OnlyFans is ever okay, but sometimes it feels like some situations might be a little bit worse than other situations. I'll move on. First question that we can kind of look at when it comes to the Bible, was any of the Bible written by women? This is a little bit of a hard question because we don't know all the people who wrote the Bible. There are no female authors of the Bible that we know of, but there's some 30 different people that wrote the Bible, and we can't know. Like, for instance, take the book of Hebrews. Who wrote Hebrews? I don't know. Some people have actually acclaimed that it might have been Paul's friend Priscilla. So who knows? We really don't. But then there are certain parts of the Bible that are said by women. So in that aspect, I guess you could say parts of it were from women. Like, for instance, think of Mary, the mother of Jesus, her whole thing that she was saying with her prayer and all that from Luke. Oh, we'll get there. We'll get there, Spencer. Don't get ahead of me. Hold on. Another example would be Miriam. Miriam has a little thing that she says in Exodus chapter 15 or something. And it's recorded there. So you could say that some parts are kind of by women, but as far as who actually held the pen, it doesn't seem like there were any women that actually wrote the Bible. So then that takes us to the next bit. Okay, well, what about examples of women in ministry in the Bible? And we actually have quite a large pool to pick from. First off, I'll turn to Matthew 28. It says in verse 1, "After the Sabbath, as the first day of the week was dawning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to view the tomb." There were some other women there too, but it doesn't list all of them. There were about 5 women or so. There was a violent earthquake because an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and approached the tomb. He rolled back the stone and was sitting on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing was as white as snow. The guards were so shaken by fear of him that they became like dead men. The angel told the women, "Don't be afraid, because I know you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he has risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he is risen from the dead, and indeed he is going ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there. Listen, I have told you." So departing quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy, they ran to tell his disciples the news. Just then Jesus met them and said, "Greetings." They came up and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. Then Jesus told them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to leave for Galilee, and they will see me there." Now keep in mind, this is not an entire account of it. For instance, Mark tells us that they all ran away and they hid and they didn't tell anybody. So that's where Mark ends. Matthew tells the rest of the story that, they did run away and hide themselves and didn't tell anybody. But then, after a while, they worked up their courage and went out and actually met with Jesus, and then they went and told the disciples. So, with that being said, one of the first things we see that's very, very important, that's oftentimes overlooked, is the very first preachers of the gospel were women. Now, this is extremely important historically because, once again, historically, women were not seen as reliable witnesses. So who does the gospel use as the first proclaimers of the gospel? Women, the ones who are overlooked and seen as unreliable witnesses. Those are the ones that God uses. And so right there you see a very important point there. They weren't, by claiming that women spread the gospel, does not do the gospel any favors. It was actually would have seen something that people would have kind of made fun of it for. But yet, the fact still remains that the first preachers of the gospel were women. Then, women, after this, women didn't just do that. They went on from there to have a position in the church as it grew. For instance, in Romans chapter 16, it goes through saying all these different people that Paul wants the Romans to greet on his behalf. And he starts off in verse 1, says, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, who is a servant, notice that word there, servant, of the church in Cenchrea. So you should welcome her in the Lord in a manner worthy of the saints and assist her in whatever matters she may require your help. For indeed, she has been a benefactor of many and of me also. So there's two things specifically I want to point out. The word here that is translated as servant is the word deacon. So to me, it seems most likely that he's talking about a woman that's serving an official position as a deacon. That seems the most likely. There is obviously the second translation here that you could translate as a servant of the church in Cenchrea, but that doesn't really seem to fit what Paul is saying here as far as what she has contributed. So that's the first thing. She's a deacon, and it also goes on to say that she's a benefactor. So in other words, she's, basically shelling out for this. She's putting herself on the line for it, which doesn't just speak to her being wealthy. It also speaks to leadership of some form. By her being a benefactor, she was a leader of some sort, probably. Especially when you combine it with the deacon bit. Now, whether this was an official position or an unofficial position, we can only speculate. But either way, it seems very probable that it was an official position. And then also she probably carried the letter for Paul to the church in Rome. So then you get to verse 3, and he goes on to say, give my greetings to Prisca and Aquila. You'll remember Prisca in the book of Acts is called Priscilla. It's the same person. But she's said to be a fellow worker with Paul. And almost half the people, not quite, but almost half the people that Paul mentions here in chapter 16 are women. Women had a very important part in the early church. They are mentioned as fellow workers, as ministers, all these different things. There's no reason to assume any inferiority. Some people will read this list and they'll say, well, yeah, but I mean, a fellow worker in that like they kept the books while the men did the real work. But there's no reason to assume that. There's nothing in there that would make you think they're doing a lesser work. Paul never talks about it in lesser terms. So you get to verse 7, and I'm skipping a lot of the other women he's talking about. I only want to hit one more woman. It says... That was a poor way of wording that. I said I only want to hit one more woman. Let me reword that. I only want to mention one more woman. Verse 7 says, greet Andronicus and Junia, my fellow Jews. Junia is a female name. Some people have tried to turn this into a masculine form, Junius, but there are 0 accounts of the form Junius, and there are over 250 references in ancient literature of the female form Junia. There is no reason to assume this is a male. It's all the evidence seems to say that it's a female. Moving forward, though, it says, Andronicus and Junia, my fellow Jews and fellow prisoners, they are noteworthy in the eyes of the apostles. That's one wording you could follow. And they were also in Christ before me. So they've been saved longer than Paul. They're Jews just like Paul. They're being persecuted just like Paul. But this part here that in the CSB says they are noteworthy in the eyes of the apostles. In my opinion, a better wording is they are noteworthy among the apostles. And I believe that in most, I shouldn't say most, a large, I shouldn't say that. There's no reason to appeal to numbers when you're trying to get your point across. The Assemblies of God will also agree with me that it seems like what he's saying here is that Junia was an apostle. So you've got a female apostle listed who was saved before Paul. And, obviously that's not the only reading that's possible. It could be that she's just known by them, but it seems more natural for the translation that she is an apostle. So you have female workers and ministers and apostles and deacons. In fact, the only example in the Bible that you don't see fulfilled is the role of pastor that is not fulfilled by an example. That doesn't mean that there weren't and can't be any female pastors. It means that the Bible doesn't have any female pastors. But in the same way, we also don't have any biblical examples of someone that was into drugs and got saved and became a pastor. Does that mean that there's no such thing as a guy getting saved off of drugs and becoming a pastor? So, just because you don't have a biblical example of it doesn't mean it didn't happen. I think we need to be careful with rushing to conclusions that is not warranted. As we look past that, we see that women served in other positions as well. For instance, in Acts 21, In Acts 21, verses 8 through 9, it's talking right here, and it says, the next day we left and came to Caesarea, where we entered the house of Philip the evangelist, who was one of the 7, and stayed with him. Now look at verse 9. This man had 4 virgin daughters who prophesied, so women can prophesy too. Then you go on to, or I guess it's before that in Acts chapter 9. Starting in verse 36, it says, in Joppa there was a disciple named Tabitha, which is translated Dorcas. How would you like to have that name? Hey, Dorcas. She must have, a life in high school really must have been hard for her. She was always doing good works and acts of charity. And we'll just stop right there, but my point being, there's a lot of examples in the New Testament of women serving in different positions. And this woman here has some sort of ministry leadership position of charity and benevolence. Think of it like a food pantry. So, I mean, these are important points. Now, women, here's the problem that we have when we're looking at women in leadership and we're looking at the Bible. Women are seen through the lens of modern eyes. That's the first problem. So we see how things are around us, we see how the world is now, and we read that back into the text. See what I mean? So now we've got like the feminist movement, we've got, some very rigid churches about women and serving in different positions over the past, 100 and 150 years, somewhere around there. And we just kind of, we have all that history to deal with. So we see the women through the lens of modern eyes, and we also see it through the lens of church history. And a lot of that church history has to do with women being relegated to inferior positions. And why did this happen? Well, historically speaking, women served very important roles in early history, and then as the church became more imperialized, it became more and more corrupted. And so as it became corrupted, things kind of became big deals that weren't big deals, and some things that should have been kept were like lost and abandoned. So you had, like, for instance, the whole thing about, well, let's just hop over to Martin Luther, who had the whole 95 Thesis deal and the different things that the church was doing. They had corruption. Obviously, that was in the 1600s, but there was a long history of the church having this slow decline. And it started with Emperor Constantine, who made the church more imperialized, made it more a part of the state instead of having it be its own thing. And this caused a lot of problems, really the start of the monks and all that, but I'm getting too off topic. My point being here, historically speaking, the church brought purpose to women. Historically speaking, the church brought freedom to women, and the church brought rights to women. Everywhere where the gospel went, women were lifted from their position. And everywhere that the gospel didn't go, didn't experience that. And so now we're on this side of it, and we're looking at it with feminist eyes, modern feminist eyes, and we're saying the church is holding women down. And it's like, well, no, historically speaking, it's not, though. Which is crazy, because people will talk about how Islam is this great religion, all this different stuff. And Islam is massively holding down women, but then Christianity is made fun of for holding women down. I just don't get it. Anyways, let's stay on topic here. It just amazes me that the church, which was so foundational to lifting women out of being oppressed, is now seen as a force of oppression. I guess when you don't know history, you just kind of make things up. You just come to your own conclusions and make it up. Anyways. Let's stay on topic. There's a lot of stuff we could say about that, but we won't. So the church, unfortunately, nowadays really takes its cues from the culture that it lives in. Take, for instance, the cancel culture. You know how ridiculous that was, right? We were canceling everything and saying, oh, well, you got to redo this. Aunt Jemima, we had to take her off the pancake syrup. The Land O'Lakes, we had to take the Native American off the packaging. All these different cancel culture things, right? But the church was doing it before. Well, you can't shop at Target because there's this one thing there that, this merchandise is being sold there that's demonic. Don't shop at Starbucks because something to do with Christmas and a cup or something, I don't know. See what I mean? There's all these things that we did cancel culture first. It's the same thing. And so a lot of times the church kind of takes its cues from the culture instead of operating counterculture. And when the church first got going, it was countercultural. And now it's kind of lost a lot of that. Moving forward, women serving is not just a New Testament concept, though. It's encouraged as an upward trajectory. And what I mean by that is, so it was, women in ministry and leadership was a thing in the Old Testament. And then in the New Testament, it was encouraged as this is going to happen more. Your daughters will have visions and dreams. Not just your sons. It's going to be something that's poured out on all flesh. Even your servants are going to. Well, and then the church decided, yeah, I hear what you're saying, Jesus, but we've got a much better plan. Let's just have it as a male-dominated thing. And now fast forward to the 2000s, and you've got churches are mostly geared for women nowadays. It's much more emotional, much more, touchy and feely. When the early church was trying to incorporate both, now the modern church is just catering to women, and nobody knows what they're doing anymore. But anyways, going to the Old Testament, we see a lot of really good examples. Obviously, Spencer already mentioned it, but in Exodus, you've got Miriam. And in Exodus 15:20 says specifically that she was a prophet and that she led the other women in worship. So we've got her listed as a prophet and as a leader. In fact, her position as a leader was not compromised until she came against Moses later on. They're in the wilderness, and her and Aaron kind of started opposing Moses. And because of that conflict, she got where she wasn't really a leader anymore. But that doesn't mean that's not because she's a woman. That's because of her sin. You go to Judges chapter 4, and there's actually a few really important things that happen in Judges. First off, there's a judge by the name of Deborah. Are you guys familiar with this at all? The judge Deborah? Okay. There's a judge by the name of Deborah, and she's a prophet, but she's also a judge. So there's a guy that goes to her, and she gives him a prophecy. And I feel like people just kind of skip past this, that Deborah was a judge. And then she tells the guy, go, but the battle's not going to be won by you. So there's this other woman called Jael who drives a tent peg through the guy's head. And so the battle is won by a woman after a woman judge gave a prophecy. These are really important things, and it's easy for us now to skip past it, but these are really important things. Later on in the book of Judges, there's another example of a random woman. I don't think it ever says her name, but she's on top of a tower, and this guy's coming against it, and she throws a millstone down, and it crushes his head. These are women who save the day. So then you get over to the book of Ruth. You see Ruth's faithfulness was clay in God's hand for him to use. You see Naomi led her family in faith, even to the point that Ruth, an outsider, followed her into the kingdom of God because of her example. You see Esther, who saved all of Israel, an entire nation. You see Mary, the mother of Jesus, who received God's promises in faith, while Zechariah was judged and went mute because of his lack of faith. You see in the book of Joshua, Rahab, a prostitute that nobody cared about. She's saved and became part of Jesus' family line, if I'm reading that correctly, and one of the ancestors of Jesus, while Achan, who was a Jew, him and his whole family lost their place with God's victory and were killed by God. You see those two characters contrasted, where the Jew lost his place in God's kingdom, but the dirty prostitute that was a Canaanite earned a place in God's kingdom. And you see a lot of things like this where women aren't just thrown off to the side. Another great example is Ishmael, who is not the son of the promise. His mom Hagar, wandering the desert, and she encounters God, whereas Sarah, the mom of the promise, Isaac, she was back at the tent with Abraham, and she was not encountered by the God who heard her. It was Hagar, the slave, who was out in the desert. So you look through the Bible, and you see a lot of these examples of women with really important things. But the Bible also gives us a lot of negative examples of women in leadership. And I'd like to point out some things about this. So I think that these examples are more of warnings for women who lead negatively. Because obviously, if you look through the Bible, you see a lot of men as good examples and bad examples, don't you? Like Solomon, good and bad. You see them contrasted. But the women that lead negatively, it seems like they're given more focus in Scripture. And I think the reason why God did that, or had the writers of the Bible do that, is to draw more of a stark contrast. So just 3 examples off the top of my head here, from when I was writing this, not from right now. First one is Eve, who led the way into sin, led her husband into sin. Jezebel, who dominated the king, who was her husband, and led the entire people in rebellion to God. And Job's wife, who was very unsupportive and unfaithful, even saying, curse God and die. So she wasn't faithful to God or to Job. And so all 3 of those examples, are women who are in rebellion. That was not the way they should have led. They were rather held up as examples of rebellion, which I think are important because all three examples of those women are women who are not in submission to their own husbands. I think that the message here that people have walked away from is women don't need to be in ministry or leadership of any position, rather than women who are rebellious should submit themselves to their husbands. That was the message that they should have gotten. Jezebel should have submitted herself to her husband rather than lording over him. Eve should have submitted herself to what Adam taught her rather than going her own way and listening to the serpent. Job's wife should have submitted herself to Job and suffered alongside of him. That's the takeaway. That doesn't mean women shouldn't lead, that they shouldn't be in ministry. It's just rather that a woman shouldn't be in rebellion. But I think the same thing is true of men, obviously, too. So that takes us to one last thing I want to look at before we close out. Why are men used more than women in the Bible? And actually, historically speaking, men are used more than women. This is kind of a bit of a quinkerdink, but I think I have a couple different reasons for why. And I just want to start this off with the obvious statement that it's not a competition. It's not boys versus girls, boys rule and girls drool or some nonsense like that, okay? It's not a competition. Okay, so let's just get that out there. And the modern conflict that we're seeing nowadays, you can't push that back into the Bible to infer something. You can't say, because we've got this issue, I'm going to read back and see what an ancient book has to say about a modern problem. No. You go and study the old thing, the Bible, and then you bring its principles into the modern age. You don't read back. What I'm trying to say here is you read the Bible as it was meant to be understood when it was written, rather than trying to force your own agenda and modern-day topic on it. You know what I mean? Because right now, what are we concerned about right now? World War III, the economy, feminism. These are the big hot topics now. Those things didn't exist in the Bible's days. So you can't go and get your own agenda and try to twist it to say what you want to say. But I think there's a couple reasons why men are used more than women typically. First off, because men were created as natural leaders, and I don't think as many women have that drive to lead. Some do, obviously, but a lot of women, they don't want to be a leader. They just want to do their thing. You know what I mean? Men, on the other hand, I see more of them want to lead. They want to take things over. They want to, have a business that takes over another business. They want their household to prosper. They want to, achieve. I mean, why do you think most military geniuses are men? They're people. It's not because the men are smarter than women. It's just men have that drive, conquer. Who do you think came up with the training for people in the army? I guarantee you that it wasn't a woman who was saying, "Get up, maggot." It was a guy. I guarantee you it was a guy. I don't know what his name was, but I guarantee you it was a guy who was saying, "Get up, maggot. Give me another 50." Because that's just how guys are wired. So men are created as natural leaders. Another thing is, and I didn't come up with this, but I totally agree with it. Men address problems vertically. Women address problems horizontally. What I mean by that is when there's a lot of problems all together, men can do this thing where they prioritize it and they hit them in order. Women do this thing where if there's too many things that's stressing them out, they see them all as equal and they get themselves stressed out. You know what I mean? They can't separate these. There's just too much. You know what I mean? It's not that there's all this stuff's not important, but a guy will usually be able to come alongside and look, this, we're not going to get it done. This is important. Let's focus on that. You know what I mean? And it just seems like guys have an easier time kind of categorizing problems like that. Women are commonly, women more commonly lead from emotions. I'm not saying they always do. I'm saying they more commonly do, rather than embracing pain for the greater good. Men embrace pain for the greater good much better than women do. Once again, this doesn't apply to every man versus every woman, okay? But generally speaking, when women look at the training that, Marines go through, they say, well, that's a little rough. But when men look at it, they say, yeah, you got to toughen them up. You know what I mean? When a father and mother, who's more likely to tell their kids, rub some dirt in it? Well, typically the guy. I mean, not always the guy, but typically it's the guy. Fathers are, when your kids are asking for snacks before the meal, the guys are okay with seeing their kids hungry for a little bit normally, and the moms tend to be a little bit more catering to them. Oh, have a snack before the meal. It's just men are able to see the embracing the pain for the greater good. Men are also able to embrace the pain of working at a job that they hate to provide for their wife and kids. Women typically have a harder time doing that. They want to prosper and succeed and do something that they love. But men, they're okay with doing something that they hate as long as they're providing. You know what I mean? They're just wired differently. That's not to say that all women do this and women can't lead. I'm just saying there's some things that men have an easier time with. Men have an easier time leading with what is. Women tend to lead from what could be. So, I don't want to deal with this problem because they might change. Whereas a man will typically say, yeah, but if they change, that's on them. But right now, they're not changing, so we got to deal with this problem. You know what I mean? Men are much more, which is why men are oftentimes condemned as being heartless by women, because they just see problems differently. Men are pack horses. Men are pack horses. They keep going with their head down and they just, suffer through. Whereas women tend to often give up for the sake of being happy. Not all women, not all the time. But women typically have a harder time going the long haul with things when they're not happy and fulfilled. They'll oftentimes give up for the sake of being happy. I had to leave that job because I wanted to be happy. Whereas men, they'll just keep going. This is obviously not true for all men of all time. It's obviously not true of all women of all time. There are exceptions. I'm just talking generally here. Men are empire builders. When you look over history, who built every single empire? Men. Who built every kingdom? Men. Who built every city? Men. It was always men. That's not to say that men are better than women. Men are empire builders. They're doers, right? When you want something done, you go to your husband, and typically he does it. Now, not all men are like that, but a lot of men are like that. Women tend to be nesters. They don't go and create the empire. They see the empire, they see the castle, and then they go to the castle to live in it. They're just wired differently. It's not to say one's better than the other. They're just different. Men strive for bigger and better, which I think is one of the traps of adultery, because they're always looking for the next thing. Like, my wife's good looking, but if I find a better woman, a more attractive woman, and there's always that lure in the back of every man's head that there might be someone more attractive. And as you get older, you kind of get out of that. But women don't really have that phase. They don't really go through that like men do, and they think men are such pigs because they don't understand how men think. Whereas women tend to think smaller scale and stuff like that. They don't have that achieve mindset, which obviously isn't true for all women, but still. Nowadays, though, and this is extremely important, women nowadays tend to live... let me say that differently. We live in a time when women are much more likely to step out than they used to be 50 or 100 years ago. We live in a time where women are just much more likely to do that. So what you're going to see is a rise of female leaders. This isn't a bad thing, just the way that the pendulum goes. And so you're going to see more because there's more opportunity now. The biggest issue that you're going to have with the new generation of women, there's going to be plenty of women stepping into leadership. But the biggest issue you're going to see is they're going to have the modern women of this generation have very much an attitude problem. They are very disrespectful and they're not submissive. And the thing about leadership is you can't lead if you can't be led. If you ever want to be a leader, you have to be under someone else. That's the way leadership is. So if you have an unsubmissive attitude, you're not going to make it. And the modern-day feminist movement, they're just a bunch of women who are always disgruntled about something, and they always have an attitude problem about everything. You know what I mean? Things that don't even matter. They're just like, they go around with their blue hair and stuff, and they're really thinking they're changing the world when all they're doing is just kind of making a stink for themselves. So I want just a few more things before we wrap up. This actually is, we're going to close with this. You cannot control the ebb and flow of the culture that you live in. The culture goes back and forth. Women are going to go through times of having more rights and less rights. You can do nothing to control that. But you can act in faith whatever the situation you're in. For instance, when you look at Mary, the mother of Jesus, she acted in faith in the time that she lived in. Esther, the one who saved the nation of Israel, she acted in faith in the time that she was in. So right now, we live in a time where women have more chance to lead than they ever, than they have in a good long while, at least in this part of the world. And we'll just leave it off there. We'll leave history lessons for some other time. But so the question isn't how much rights can a woman have today. The question is, what are we going to do to act in faith where we are? And I think that's a lesson that applies to both men and women. So just to summarize what we looked at tonight, the Bible has many good examples of women in leadership, and we'll get more into the specifics next week as far as verses. We're going to start going through from Genesis book by book, specific verses that talk about women in leadership and see where we get through with that. Are there any questions with anything that we talked about tonight? Teresa. Because they're just built different. That's the short answer. Men are used more than women just because they tend to be doing it more. Let me give you an example, Teresa. I'll give you something that's easier, okay? Let's say, here's a good example, okay? Let's say there's 4 people, and there's 4 dresses. Okay, let's pick 4 people. I'm going to pick you, I'm going to pick Spencer, I'm going to pick Terry, and I'm going to pick Freya. Okay, I picked 4 people, there's 4 dresses. Okay, so out of those 4 people, who is most likely to wear a dress? Name the people. You and Freya, okay. And Terry, why didn't you mention Spencer? What's your point? That's my point too. See, guys are used more by God than girls because they're the ones out there doing it already. God uses people who are doing stuff with willing hands. See what I mean? The only thing that stops a woman from being used by God is not doing it. You want to be used by God? Seek Him. Seek Him with your whole heart. Read the Bible as much as you can. Pray as much as you can. Go out there and do stuff. Sing in church. Do different stuff. Volunteer for different stuff we're doing. And you're going to notice that God uses you. Because God uses people who are willing, whether they're boys or girls. And that's what I'm saying. God uses boys more because they're out there doing it more. Make sense? Historically, not necessarily today. So, any other questions?